Hello, hi, we're gonna get started. So thank you for joining us. It's early on the first day, so thanks for everyone for showing up. My name is Christian Bates. I am the Solutions Architect Manager for the Hybrid Edge Group for Worldwide Public Sector. So the Hybrid Edge Group, we cover a number of different services and products, right? So Outpost, Wavelengths, Local Zones, Snow, VMC, VMware on cloud. So today we're gonna talk to you about the AWS Outpost, right? So this is a Chalk Talk. So if you've never been to a Chalk Talk before, Rob and I are going to kind of talk to some slides for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for any questions, any use cases, design pattern questions that you have, and we'll be able to whiteboard some of those scenarios for you around Outpost, around Hybrid Edge, or any AWS questions that you might have that we can answer.
All right, and I'm Rob Goodwin. I'm a specialist. I report to Christian, so you can ask a lot of questions because my boss help me out on that. I've been with AWS for 4.5 years. I've been in a number of different industries, from manufacturing, healthcare, insurance, startups, environmental. I've been in the industry, IT industry, for about 30 years, so it's been a while. So today we're going to talk about Outposts, I think. And so before we actually talk about what the Outpost is, let's talk a little bit how we got there. So everyone understands what a region is. They're familiar with our talk about regions and everything else, the geographic area. You know, it's not a specific building yet, it's just an area. And we break up that area into availability zones. And everybody's familiar with the availability zones, right? Another logical partition of that region for fault tolerance, power, networking, et cetera. So in that AZ, that's where we put our data centers. So we have at least one, if not multiple data centers in an availability zone. So where does Outpost come into play? Well, Outpost is really what we're thinking about. Think about we've taken a rack in that data center that's in the AZ and move it on-prem with you. So we're taking that rack and move it all the way over into your data center with a long network cable. So it's really that logical construct of Outpost and the availability from the availability zone in your data center. So what the Outpost is, it's a managed service. Okay, you're not buying hardware. A lot of people think, oh, I'm getting an Outpost. I'm going to put the Outpost on where I want. I'm going to manage it. It's my server. It's not. It's a service. So AWS manages the hardware remotely. We understand what's going on with it. We send out text to replace the hardware. It's a service. Just like you would use EC2 in region, it's the same pane of glass. So what does the Outpost actually look like? You rack, right? Just like you would in your data center, but it's fully built by AWS. And we actually take it and roll it into your data center. And all we do is hook up the power, hook up the networking. It's fully redundant within the rack itself. And we're going to talk about redundancy in a little bit. You manage it through the same AWS console. When I say manage it, I'm talking about use it. Use it deploying EC2 instances, creating EBS volumes, setting up your subnets. Everything is done through that single pane of glass of the AWS console, the AWS CLI, or your CDKs. So why would you use an Outpost? You know, I have my workloads in the cloud. Why do I need something on-prem? Well, there are a number of different use cases to do that. One is latency-sensitive use cases. If I'm running a manufacturing facility, I need my IoT workloads or my video to see those tolerances. I can't afford the 15 millisecond response time from the region. I need it less than 10 milliseconds. Or I need local data processing. I have petabytes of data on my on-prem, but I want to use the compute resources of AWS to access it and do analytics on it. The third reason is data residency. sometimes there's regulations where you have to have your data and your compute within a certain logical boundary of a country, a state, a municipality. One of our customers, FanDuel, has that issue. They're a gaming site. They have to have their data, their processing, stay within the realm of the state. So that's the other reason for that data residency. So the Outpost does solve those three things. But with that, there's a little change in that AWS share responsibility model. Now, you've seen this probably before, and usually that middle box is down in the AWS realm, where we manage the data center itself and the power and the networking. Well, with the Outpost, that part of the responsibility model moves up to the customer. You're now responsible for the power in your data center. Even though we're managing the rack, the customer is responsible for that network connectivity to the rack. And you have to worry about your capacity management. Now, think about the cloud as the ocean. Like infinite. But the rack is just like a bucket of water coming in your data center. So your capacity is less. You have to manage that capacity, what you want to run in a data center. It's more finite. And with that.
Okay, so when we talk about Outposts, when we talk about the cloud, the environment, your own data center, right? So what could possibly go wrong? A number of things could possibly go wrong, right? So kind of looking at the chart, or the slide, right? So the AWS cloud, if you're familiar with AWS and our kind of region concepts, so that's somewhat familiar. We have our WAN connection, which goes out to the data center, and then we'll kind of go through this process with regards to internet connectivity, and then we kind of blew up that data center a little bit to bring it a little bit closer with regards to what the outpost looks like, right? So, and how you can configure an outpost. And we can talk about that kind of later, right? So there's a couple different things that you want to consider for what could go wrong. The first one is network failures, right? You have ISPs, you have service disruptions, a link that can go down, and you need to ensure proper alternatives, right? So so part of that best case best case design is to have multiple ISPs, multiple connections into your own data center back out to the cloud. The next one, instance failures, right? So hardware goes down, right? Applications can hang, operating systems can crash. You need to ensure that you're architecting your application to tolerate instance failure, right? So when you use instances inside of AWS Cloud, you kind of have that already, right? Or you're designing for that if you're going from availability zone or region to region. Next one would be server failures, right? So even the best high quality of servers fail, right? At some point, we need to assure that we have backups for those in case of a failure. Rack data center, they can go down, right? So your data center connection can go down. Think of power outages, think of like earthquakes or something like that. So those are things to consider. Very rarely, availability zones will go down. It does happen, but that's why we have multiple availability zones, and that's why when we talk about best practices for developing solutions for applications, designing applications, we always want to use multiple availability zones or multiple regions if required, right? So the Outpost Rack does have built-in resilience, right? So we do have redundant fiber cable patch panels for there. The services on Outpost come with managed networking. So you have your VPC networking on Outpost. We provide the redundancy and availability and the implementation on the rack, but you do have redundancy for networking. We take care of the AZ in the background. So when you're connecting to the AZ, Amazon is doing that. Some things require some input from you. For example, redundant power feeds. They can be requested and connected to redundant power slots. And then what we call droplets, but the EC2 hosts and storage nodes, the i3ENs, but storage nodes, so think of EBS or S3 storage. So you want to make sure that there's redundant for those. when you're ordering an outpost for your own data center, you'll work with an SA like us or another SA to kind of figure out what that rack would look like. You can also have multiple racks for multiple redundancy. So security real quick. We can always deep dive into security, but just real quick. So all data is encrypted on the rack. It's encrypted in transit as well as in rest. There is what we call a Nitro key card, right? So it's an actual physical device on the rack. If you pull this key, it destroys the device, right? And so therefore destroying all of the data. So it's a very important key. So if you ever think the rack is compromised, the data is compromised, or if you're just going to shut down the rack and return it to AWS, you're going to want to pull this key to destroy all that data. Data center availability zones, resilience, right? So again, we have our AWS cloud. We have region 1 and region 2. Best practice for deploying an outpost to these regions is you're going to want to have multiple outposts anchored to multiple availability zones. Right now, one outpost can only be anchored to one availability zone. So, if you want to have true resilience, redundancy in one data center, have multiple outposts connected to multiple availability zones, and that way you can kind of sync and replicate and back up your data in case one goes down. If you're doing more of kind of a COOP type design or a true DR design, then multiple data centers, multiple outposts, and then you can connect them to multiple availability zones within multiple regions, right? So those are some possible scenarios for that. You can distribute and replicate your instances, your EBS volumes, your S3 buckets. You can replicate those across the outposts. If you don't have any data residency concerns, then you can also back them up into the AWS cloud. WAN connection. Oh, I forgot to go through the slides or the animation. So learning on demand, right? So overall, we have 500 plus free digital courses that you can learn. So for Skill Builder, take a screenshot of this slide or use the code to kind of get access to those Skill Builder training slides.
And with AWS certifications, we have a lot of certification practices here at the Summit. But it's great to become certified. You join the certified community. There's a lot of interaction out there, use cases, training, exam guides. So with that, thank you for that little slide presentation. Well, we really want to open up questions, which is great. So the question is that the Outpost is an extension of the availability zone, but how does it tie into the VPC? Right? So you're right, it is tied to one availability zone, and it's tied to your VPC the same way as that same availability zone. You create a subnet on the Outpost, just like you would any other subnet. And then you place your EC2 instances and run it just like you would in your VPC. There are constructs that you will have to understand a little bit further. One is called the local gateway that is on the Outpost. That local gateway is your egress to your local data center. And there's a route table there that you route, but the Outpost is part of the availability zone. It's not a separate availability zone. It's an extension of the one you're tethered to, but it is a separate subnet. So the question is, we have S3 in the region. How does S3 work on the availability on the Outpost? So we do have object storage on the Outpost. It is a new class of S3 where there is object storage there. It is limited to access from the EC2 instances on the Outpost. So if you're within your own data center and you want your servers on your data center to try to write to S3, you have to go through an EC2 instance to do that. Because it's just because how the S3 Outpost class is set up, because of S3 has that global unique endpoint for you. It's different with a little bit different on the Outpost. We can get a little more really deep dive on that too, if you want later. It's a little different, but the object storage is there. Okay. Okay. Oh, they want me in the highlights. Great. Okay, we have 2 questions.
So can you explain a little bit more about the OS volume on EC2 instance and how persistent that is? Because I've heard different things. I'm not exactly clear. Obviously, EBC persists, but if you reboot an EC2 instance or it goes down, how persistent is the OS volume?
So the question is, how persistent is the OS volume on an EC2 instance on the Outpost? Okay. Now there's 2 different pieces of Outpost. There's the Outpost Rack, and then there's the Outpost Server. So we didn't talk about the server. The server is a 1U or 2U Outpost. So on the Rack, the EC2 instance, since the boot volume is EBS, it is persistent. Okay. So you create it just like you would within the region. In your VPC, you create EC2, which normally creates the boot volume with EBS, and you launch it up. You can start, stop, and run it. Outpost Server is a little different in that regards. Outpost Server is literally just that droplet, that 1U server or 2U server. There is no EBS storage on that specifically. Storage. So your AMI that you pull down from the region to launch on that droplet is going to run an instant store, and if you're not aware, instant storage is ephemeral. So when you power off that EC2 instance, you've lost that boot volume. So you'd have to bring it down and restart it that way. So that's the difference between server and rack. There was another question. Yes.
Yeah. So it's an extension. So with the Outpost Rack, you mentioned like we manage the infrastructure and the networking aspects, right? So on the same lines, when we install a rack, do we need to specify the memory and other specifications? Like, so however you do like small, large instances and all that on-prem, right? So how that works, like upfront, you need to have that specification defined.
Yeah, so there's.
I'm going to let Christian answer this one.
So you can order the Outpost Rack or the server, through the console like you would anywhere else, right? Or any of our other services. But when you do it with Outpost Rack, then that will trigger kind of a phone call from us, right? From AWS. So, and we'll work with you and your team because there's a couple different things that has to be done before that, right? So one, we're going to do an on-site visit to make sure that you have the proper floor space and power and networking and stuff like that. And then we'll also work with you to configure what that rack looks like, right? So if you can kind of see, how much compute server, how much storage server, how much EBS, how much S3, right? So we want to talk about what you're going to use the rack for. And we'll work with you with regards to how many vCPUs, how much memory, how much storage, and all that stuff before you order it. And then the rack will be custom built for that, and then we ship it out to you. Yeah. If you go to aws.com/outposts, there'll be a number of documents, white papers, best practices, but also the kind of our default configurations and pricing along with that, so you can take a look at what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, what are the scalability aspects of the storage and compute once you install the rack? Right? Can you scale up?
So if you have a rack that's not fully populated and delivered to you, then we can add droplets to that, right? We can also add racks. So up to 96 racks? How many racks?
Yeah, I think so.
96.
Right.
So every 4th or 5th rack, we install what's called an ACE rack, which is really kind of just provides connectivity and power, right, to these other racks, right? So you can scale up on racks and make one logical kind of rack, right?
And just one follow-up is serverless services that you have, like glue services and all that, can they access the data that is in the Outpost?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like seamless, right?
It is, and we don't have that slide, so I apologize. But there are a number of different services that you can run locally on. I don't think Glue is one of them, but we do have a number of services that you can run locally on Outpost. But then you also have all of the services that that are run from the region, right? And you have access to all of that. Again, remember, Outpost is still connected to the region, to the availability zone, and you're managing that device the way you would manage any other service through the Amazon console. So you still have access to all of the services if they run locally or not.
Okay.
Only the classification of S3 is different.
Correct. And it's just the way that it's done. Yeah.
Right.
And we install the databases like Redshift and Aurora and stuff like that.
Redshift and Aurora do not run locally, if I remember correctly. We do have RDS, so there are some flavors of RDS that you can run locally. Aurora and Redshift, you would still have to run from the region.
Right.
But you would be able to kind of still access that data. EMR runs locally, but you would still be able to access that data and then condition that data or analyze that data locally.
Do that through Spectrum or are the instances there on the availability geology?
So if you can use the instances locally on the Outpost to access that data that you have in the cloud. Yeah.
He had his hand up first. I'm going to go back here.
After the design phase, what's the lead time for hardware?
So the question is, after the design phase, what's the lead time for the hardware? Generally, it's about 6 to 8 weeks from that, the whole process. Back to the pre-configured SKU. So things that are set.
Thanks.
Again, there's customization as well.
When I order stuff from like Cisco, they're 5 months out.
Right. We're Amazon 2-day shipping, right? No.
Amazon Prime. So
Prime member, yeah. Oh. So, right. So it's about 6 to 8 weeks out. Okay. He was next. I'm sorry. Well, I'll get to you. All right. Great.
You know, in like the region, you have like all the different various Amazon services that are managed by Amazon, updated and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you discuss like the services that are managed by Amazon in the Outpost? Is that the same like type of update schedule or any differences?
it is.
Yes.
So the Outpost is a managed service, right? So AWS is responsible for all of that, right? So let's say all of the software and the hardware, right? So we're monitoring that device. So if we notice that there are droplets that are failed or if there's errors, then we'll coordinate with you to bring someone on site and have them fix those problems, right?
Right.
It is an overall, so it is managed. So although you have a key to access the rack, it's really pretty much hands off, right? I mean, you have the key so you can plug into the local gateway, but droplets, everything, we monitor that just like we monitor our own racks inside of our own data center.
Onto that, one of the requirements for Outpost Rack is you have to sign up for enterprise support, and the enterprise support kicks off that, helps with that management, that support process of when things happen on the rack or monitoring and things like that. Okay.
So how does the billing work in the rack? So is it more affordable to use the rack to pull your data in AWS, or is it more affordable to use the cloud, or are you effectively duplicating your billing into the cloud to the rack, like Redshift or
Okay.
how does that work?
So the question is, how does billing work with Outpost Rack? Is it cheaper? With the rack cheaper than in region?
That's a trick question, and I'd
Yeah.
rather answer that with the cameras off.
well-
But however, I
well,
will say that if you remember the specific use cases that we gave you, right, to where does Outpost Rack make sense, right? So data residency, low latency applications, that is where you want to use Outpost Rack, right? I would, as a solutions architect, I wouldn't necessarily say to use Outpost Rack just because you want something tangible inside of your data center and you like blinky lights, right? I wouldn't say that, but it is. You're gonna have a better return of investment if you run your applications inside the cloud when you're able to.
Right.
Right.
So to go along with that, the Outpost Rack, unlike if I'm running EC2 instance in a region where I can just start it up and run it and then shut it down and not pay for it, if you're getting a rack, you're committing to either a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year timeline, and you're billed accordingly. So if your timeline is 1 year, your monthly costs are going to be higher for that. And again, you're getting a lot of resources on within your data center.
Is there a data timeline commitment based on the capacity of the storage and droplets and so
So when you order an Outpost rack, those are your options, right? 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, right? It doesn't necessarily matter what your configuration is, scale, right? So because you can order, your capacity can go up and down, right? So what you ordered on day one could change, a year and a half out, right? So so the more droplets that we add, the more storage that you add, your bill would increase. Just like it would if you were running services inside the region, right?
You're committing to what the capacity is inside the hardware, not necessarily what you're actually consuming with it.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a little difference, a little bit on the storage, and let me explain that. So there's a number of different tiers of storage in terms of pricing, not like capability, but pricing on storage. So if you're committing to like 11 terabytes, it's a certain price. If you're committing to 25 terabytes, it's a different price. You go up to 30, it's a tiering model on the storage. So the more storage you're committing to, the less per month you're going to be paying on that over the time of, right. So, sure.
When you're transferring stuff between your outpost and the region, are there any incurred expenses of that?
So when you're transferring data,
Let's say you have data on your outpost,
right,
right? And you want to move that data up to the region, or
Right.
vice versa.
right. So the outpost is connected to the region by the service link.
Yeah.
The service link is a set of VPN tunnels that basically anchor to the availability zone back, and that data is then transferred back and forth there. Usually, that data is going over a direct connect link, or you can go out through the internet. I don't think there's any other additional charges for the outpost on that data transfer. However, with the direct connect, there are data transfer fees, ingress fees, or egress fees through internet gateway if you're going through a VPN or out through the internet to the public endpoints. Yes?
And I still have my backup solution to the cloud, all that other good stuff in Outpost Rack.
So the question is, do I keep all my backup solutions from the outpost up to the region? Yes. You create snapshots and you can transfer those back to the region for your backups. Any other questions? Outpost? Anything?
Could be anything AWS related.
Yes.
So to follow on to the question I asked you before,
Right.
So obviously Linux is a whole different animal, but from a Windows perspective, that you would have to build a custom AMI with all your apps already there.
Okay. So
Something like that, right? Because you got to register DLLs and all that other stuff.
Right.
It's
So,
not necessarily modern apps, and then maybe it's just not a good fit.
so the question is, from a Windows perspective, making sure the AMI is up to date, deploy an Outpost server versus Outpost Rack.
It's got that ephemeral.
Right. The image is going to come down from the region from S3. So depending on how large that AMI is, really relates to how quickly that transfer happens and how quickly that EC2 instance becomes healthy. So the more leaner you have your instance running on the Outpost server, the quicker, or leaner the AMI, the quicker that's going to start up. And that's something the solutions architect can help advise you on and understand that. The Outpost server, again, is made, again, local data processing, maybe in a restaurant or something to that effect, where you need that local data processing, but that you don't need that data durability on that server. Right. You just need the apps running and transfer the data back to the region. Okay. So the server might not be a good instance for that, but the rack, again, depending on the space and what you want to do, the rack can handle that without an issue.
Are we using the same direct link that we use today to connect to on-prem cloud? Are you going to use the same, or you have a dedicated direct link?
All right. So the question is, can I use the same direct connect?
Yeah,
or your VPN to the cloud for the service link? The answer is yes. You can use the same one, with the caveat that you have to understand how much bandwidth you're using. If you have a shared direct connect where you only have like 500 meg, then you're going to have probably a little bit of a problem there. But if you have at least a 1 gig direct connect or larger, then you can easily share that, because you would carve off a private VIF to go into the VPC that anchors it. Any other questions? Anything about AWS questions? Sure.
Can you talk about how you can have like multiple outposts and like just your thought process from an architectural standpoint if you put them in the same availability zone or different?
Okay, the question is, what's the thought process of having multiple Outpost racks in the same AZ, or spreading across AZs or even regions? Okay. Since you presented those slides, you can talk about that.
Sure. So it's really kind of based on what you're designing for, right? So what applications are you running? How many virtual CPUs you're going to need? How much memory or storage that you're going to need to run these applications, right? So you can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 kind of outposts put together and make them one logical outpost, right? So if that makes sense, then that is that's a viable design use case, right? To be able to provide redundancy or HR or COOP environments is when you would want to anchor something similar or something to fail over to multiple AZs, right? You wouldn't necessarily be able to have multiple outposts in one logical outpost connected to different availability zones. That would not be a path forward, right? So again, any redundancy or any if you have multiple outposts for multiple use cases, then you might want to anchor them to multiple availability zones.
Right. Especially, if you're running a production workload on an outpost, you want either some sort of disaster recovery in another outpost, or maybe even region if you can handle that latency for a short period of time. But
so I guess extension of that, you had multiple like physical racks for your outposts. They were in 2 physical locations, we'll call it about 800 miles away from each other. Would you put them in the same logical outpost, or you keep them separate?
Keep them separate.
right.
Yeah. A logical outpost would typically be in the same availability zone, in the same data center, because they're kind of standing next to each other, right? So, and then, every 4th rack is what we call that ACE rack. And so they would all kind of have to be together to make up, one availability or one logical outpost.
Right.
And then you put them in 2 different availability zones.
One availability zone. Correct.
Right. So I want to clear. So the same availability zone in terms of the ACE rack versus your scenario, right? So your scenario, you're thinking of disaster recovery or COOP, having spread data center, just like if you do it in the cloud. Since an outpost is tethered to the availability zone, it has the same fate. So if the availability zone goes down, you lose that control plane to the outpost. Things still run, but you lose the ability to launch new instances and manage those immediately. So the idea what Christian is saying is have it in the same region, but 2 AZs. Now again, they look like they're in the same VPC. They are in the same VPC. So the data going up through the service link can move across without an issue.
So if the region went down, it would still run locally, but we wouldn't be able to access it?
If a region or the AZ goes offline, all right, the ability to control the outpost is impacted. Meaning that if I'm going in and want to launch an instance on the outpost, I can't, since there's no connectivity to it. Your ability to access applications running on the outpost would happen through that local gateway. So you would still be able to access the applications locally through that local gateway on running instances. You would just lose the ability to launch new instances and manage the outposts through that single pane of glass until that link comes back online.
Any services that you are kind of using that are not running locally, or is what's going to start degrading after a couple of hours, right?
Right.
So security, IAM rules, users, groups, adding users and stuff like that, right? So those are some of the concerns. Anything that you're running locally still would be customer facing and still be accessible.
Right. And that's important. Like the quote up there, failures, we want to help architect for failure. And that's one of the things with the solutions architect would come in and help architect with you to make sure that you have the ability to absorb a failure, understand what happens in a failure so that your applications can continue to run locally. Can you run the RDS instance and what? Can you run RDS on Outpost? We do have a couple flavors of RDS that can run on Outpost. I believe it's Postgres and MySQL currently. Okay, now I want to be clear. It's RDS Postgres and RDS MySQL. Currently not RDS Aurora. We're working on that. I think next up is RDS SQL Server. I believe that's the next thing they're working on.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are flavors, a couple flavors of RDS that can run. And again, it's the RDS part is managed, in terms of the patching of that instance and the management of the database engine, just like you would in the cloud. I think there was a question here.
For the ISP and the connectivity, what kind of bandwidth requirements are there?
So what is the bandwidth requirements from the ISP or connectivity? I'm going to say minimum of 1 gig. There's latency requirements that are required. It's about 150 millisecond latency requirement between the outpost and the region, so that things can operate. So bandwidth at all, again, I think it really depends how populated your rack is. Because again, if you have a smaller rack, let's say four servers, all right, the amount of data that's pushing through versus 12 is different. So in terms of your applications and what you need to reach back into the region, it depends on, I would say, the size of the outpost.
110 and 40 are the bandwidth requirements. So either one of those three.
Oh, right. So connecting to local network, right? Is that what you're saying? The local network is 1 gig, 10 gig, or 40 gig, but the bandwidth from on-prem to region for the service link.
That was a question.
Okay.
Question? Okay. Right. Any other questions? Excellent. And again, we'll be here if there's any other questions that come up. Please fill out the survey. You're going to hear that all day today. I appreciate that. So make sure we appreciate the feedback. Do we get slides?
I think the slides will be posted somewhere next week. The video will also be posted as well. So just follow up through the app or through the app and see when slides are posted. Otherwise, but we still have 20 minutes in the room, so we'll hang out and answer any questions or side conversations if you like. Anyways, thank you for joining us. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.